Hello, outsiders. Today I have another story for you. This one is called An Unfortunate Friendship with Crows. For a long time, we've known that crows are incredibly intelligent. From witnessing them using crossing walks to crush nuts and get food, to then testing how easily they can pick up and use very basic tools, but we never quite knew how intelligent crows might be. As time goes by and more testing is done, we realize that they're capable of a lot more than we initially thought. In the late 1990s and the early 2000s, thanks to research by wildlife biologist John Marsloff, we've realized that crows may be able to recognize faces. The studies involved wearing rubber masks. Students who were helping with the research while banding the crows would wear different rubber masks, and then while walking across the campus at a later date, they would wear the rubber mask again. Thanks to the banding process being relatively unpleasant to the crows, when they wore these masks, the crows would then caw at them loudly and scold them. Over time, they began to realize that not only the banded crows would begin to caw and to chide these mask-wearing people, but also crows who had never been banded. And as time went by, this same behavior would crop up even if no banded crows were anywhere in the vicinity. What this shows is not only are crows capable of recognizing human faces, but also they're capable of communicating with other crows what certain humans look like. Our story today takes place in a small London suburb called Beckenham. On Sedge Hill Road specifically, just around the corner from Sedge Hill School. There's a row of terraced houses. Most of these houses have been subdivided and turned into flats. Now, these aren't particularly desirable flats. The flats in question that we're looking at were clearly once a family home, but now, in their separation, each room had become a room for a tenant. This meant one of the rooms was what used to be a living room. The shape of the room hadn't really changed. It's difficult to change the shape of a living room, and it's difficult to make a living room not look like a living room, even if you put a bed and a small table inside. The person living there, they weren't exactly particularly affluent, thus why they were there, and they didn't have a lot of furniture either. Simple bed, simple table, no chairs. They sat on the floor to eat meals while watching streaming services on an old laptop. Their days consisted pretty much heading off to work, heading home, catching up on the TV shows that they liked to watch, eating, sleeping, doing it again. The weekends they would spend walking around the local area. They were blessed with a beautiful park called Beckenham Place Park, large and plenty of places to explore if you enjoyed the outside, a small swimming lake, plenty of woodland, plenty of hills, and lots of people watching to be done. In the summer, a small bar opened up nearby and there was a cafe that served odd foods. It just so happened that today was a weekend. However, they hadn't yet been able to get up, head out, and do the things that they would usually do, as previously described, on the weekend, and were awoken very early in the morning by an incredibly loud banging as something fell down the chimney. Now, the person living in this flat, they'd be forgiven for not really paying much attention to the fireplace in the room. It was boarded up and painted over and was clearly no longer functioning, or at least wasn't intended to be used, as a fake piece of marbling had been put up over the front of the fireplace. This fake piece of marbling they had assumed was real and that it was completely sealed. But no, it was instead a piece of plywood with some plastic marble effect put over the top. Now, whatever it was that had fallen down this chimney, it was clearly causing quite a commotion, moving around, slapping its limbs against the inside of this plastic, which reverberated like a drum and echoed around the house, meaning that the person in the flat definitely couldn't sleep, but certainly had to do something. Now, they knew the longer that they left it, the more agitated the animal might become, or, worse still, less agitated. Less agitated, as in it had died. Now, if something had died, it means that that smell would be stuck in that flat pretty much forever. Unfortunately, the resident didn't really have the means to move at this moment in time, and didn't really feel like worsening their living situation even more with the consistent smell of death. So, something had to be done. While the slapping and the drumming continued, the resident looked at the fireplace to try and find some way that they might be able to smash, slide out, remove the piece of plastic and wood that was covering the entrance to the fireplace. After some inspection, they realised that the mantel of the fireplace wasn't actually built into the wall, and instead was just a facade that had been placed in front, and quite clearly could be removed if they had a certain number of tools. They did not have any number of tools. They had never needed tools in their entire life. So, it was time to go and purchase some. They head round the corner and down the road, past the Lidl and further still, to the large industrial estate that housed a Sainsbury's, a Sports Direct, but most importantly, a B&Q, where they could pick up the tools needed to remove the fireplace from the wall. The entire time they made this walk, they were steadily daydreaming about what could be behind it. Optimists as they were thinking that possibly it was a squirrel or maybe a stray cat, something that they might be able to tame or domesticate, or that was already domesticated that might give them some company, might add some cheer to the dreary surroundings that they had to live in day by day. On their return, they took the plastic wrap and unclipped the small box that contained a handle and some interchangeable screwdriver heads, and set to work taking it off of the wall, ever excited about what could be behind it. After a short time of twisting, pulling, and yanking, they managed to get the faux fireplace off of the wall and slide aside the piece of wood with plastic. When slid aside, they were met with some of the darkest black they had ever seen. The fireplace was full of loose ash and charcoal that spilled and spread across the floor as a small, tired, feathery body tumbled onto the floor, leaving with it a mark of black as it skidded on the linoleum. Once out, it began to gain its senses, shocked by the light, but it stood up and tried to find where it was meant to be. A large, black, menacing crow stood in the middle of the floor and began cawing and squawking and flapping, sending ash and debris all across the room, flying around, landing on the small table, landing on the bed, leaving stamps of taloned foot everywhere that it went. Clearly, it was incredibly distressed, and clearly, so was the resident of the flat. They felt incapable of managing to get it out of there. They had only a small window on the top, nothing that opened fully. The area was full of crime, so windows were unfortunately a bit of a commodity. They tried and they tried with a towel and a t-shirt to flick and whip and get the crow out of the room, but the crow kept trying to climb back into the fireplace, not understanding that that wouldn't lead to its eventual escape. It kept digging in the ashes with its beak, flicking them around the room. The resident threw the towel, missing the crow, but the waft that came after it sent it flying towards the open small window, and then with another throw of the t-shirt, the bird was gone. The resident had to sit for a few moments, just taking in what had just happened. They really, really were hoping that they would have ended up with some kind of cute companion, some kind of friend, but no, it was a terrifying crow. They tidied up their room and began dusting up the ash, just wanting to start their day and do something far more normal. While dusting up the ash, they found a small card. It looked like it had been in the fireplace for some time, but it didn't necessarily fall down the chimney. Because the mantel was removable from the wall, that meant that there was a small gap in between the wall and the mantel, which meant the card could have, at one point, while the room was used as a living room, slipped down in between that little gap and ended up in the fireplace. Now, oddly enough, the card seemed to be some kind of education tool for a child. It had the image of a blackbird, it had the word blackbird in English, and it also had Hey Niao, which was blackbird in Chinese. The resident didn't know much about the previous occupants of this house. They assumed, simply from what they had found, that it was very likely that the residents were previously a Chinese couple that had a young child, possibly when the house was still a full house and not split into flats, and they were teaching that child common English words and, clearly, common English birds. A strange coincidence, considering how close a blackbird and a crow are in appearance, but a coincidence nonetheless. They went about the day, much as they always had, going for a stroll around Beckenham Place Park, though this time they were very aware of the crows flying overhead. They'd never paid them much mind before, because they'd just been crows. Don't think of crows flying overhead, they don't seem threatening or menacing, they are just crows. But having had such a close interaction, it now drew their attention. Like when you get your fortune read, and then you see nothing but things that the fortune teller said for the rest of the day. It's at the front of your mind. The next day, they woke up and headed for work. They didn't feel like getting the bus, they didn't feel like getting the train, so they walked down the hill and started walking along the Ravensbourne River, which was at the bottom of Beckenham Place Park, heading in to a town called Bromley. They worked in a small office there, just an administrative role, nothing serious, mainly dealing with post and calls that had come in from different customers. The day went by much as normal, other than the presence of a few crows that had started landing just outside the window of his office. He was on a higher up floor. This wasn't necessarily abnormal. Birds would often land there, though usually it was pigeons or seagulls looking for food. Very rarely was it actually crows. As the resident understood, crows usually went to other places for food and wouldn't necessarily scavenge off of office workers. At one point, while on a phone call, one of the crows dropped a small bone through the window. The bone was dry and clean and sun-bleached white, though some of the colleagues of the resident of the flat started to freak out at the thought of a dirty bone dropped by a dirty bird onto one of their desks. So Terence, the cleaning manager, came along with some tissue paper and cleaned up the bone, waving it at some of the female colleagues on his way out, just to tease them, just to gross out the ladies who worked there. This was much like Terry. He was a cheeky chap. He liked to do this sort of thing. All of this happened before the resident could even hang up the phone, before they could even mention to their colleagues about the crow that he'd found, and before he could mention it again, the phone had rung again. Once they'd finished up at their work, they headed home. And in the evening, upon returning home, as they were coming down the street, they noticed a line of small black silhouettes along the wall of their front garden. They weren't loud, but they were definitely making a lot of noise. A constant chatter. Almost like whispered squawks. Almost like conversation. Similarly, they weren't fighting with each other, but they definitely seemed to be arguing. Mildly shoving, pecking, nipping at each other. Nothing truly violent, nothing truly that you could call fighting. But it did seem like they weren't agreeing, like they were annoyed. As they came by, the crows stopped, as much as a crow can stop. They observed the resident, their heads tilting so that their eyes could see them from different angles. They'd stopped nipping at each other, and they'd stopped, let's say, talking, and were now just bobbing around their heads, trying to get a better view, trying to take in the person. The resident went inside, not knowing what else to do. Once the door was shut, the crows began to speak again. As the resident was on the bottom floor, facing this garden wall, they could hear them. They could keep hearing them. They could barely hear the show they were watching because of the crows. They certainly couldn't sleep that night. Gradually through the night they would wake up to go to the window and check on the crows, and they would see that on occasion one would leave and another would arrive, almost like they were all doing shifts. There didn't seem to be a single moment when one of the crows wasn't there. Sometimes just a few, but then when they were coming to leave and returning home from work each day, they noticed the numbers would go up. Almost like they were tracking their movements. They knew where they were going to be and when, and every time just watched them. When the weekend rolled around again, in the morning, around the same time that the crow had first fallen through their chimney, there was a clacking at the door. Not a knocking, a clacking. A clacking of the bills of the birds against the window. The resident didn't know what to do. Did they answer the door to birds? Did they let them in? Feed them seed that they didn't have? Were they meant to let this one crow fly back up through the chimney? Did the crow not realise that it had gotten out? Did the crow think it had fallen into some alternative dimension and the only way to solve the whole issue was to fly back up through the chimney from whence it came? They noticed the card. They remembered the card. They didn't think it was incredibly important, but they'd put it to one side anyway, thinking maybe they'd use it as a bookmark sometime, or just a punctuation when telling this story to someone new. They went to their front door, and, instead of opening it, they simply reverse posted the card through the letterbox, pushing it to the outside. They then looked through the letterbox. One of the crows had picked up the card and flown back to the garden wall so they could see them properly. Clacked its beak against the low wall a couple of times, still holding the card, and then flew away. The rest of the birds followed. The next day, the same thing happened. There was a tapping against their door once more. This time they opened it. A crow was stood in their doorway. Clearly, the crow recognized them, but they certainly didn't recognize the crow. They couldn't tell one crow from another, but these crows definitely knew them. After looking at the crow on their doorstep for a moment, they looked up. They noticed on the fence opposite, on the other side of the road, was entirely lined with crows. The one on their doorstep clacked on the floor a couple times with their beak, and then took a few steps out into the road. Once just outside the garden, they did the same thing again, clacking and then looking at the resident of the flat, clacking and looking. Walking down the road, clacking and looking. Walking down the road, clacking and looking. The resident couldn't help but follow. What else were they meant to do? They'd never seen a crow behave like this before. They thought maybe it was leading him somewhere, but they also didn't really see how that was possible. They must have just been interpreting animal behavior in a human way. They must have just been applying their own sensibilities to the random behavior of a crow. Something with a tiny, tiny brain, they thought, that couldn't possibly be leading them anywhere important, they thought. It's a crow. It's a crow. But they followed. A crow was leading a person. They led them across the road and down the hill. They led them into Beckenham Place Park. They led them down towards the small bridge that heads up and over the train track that runs through the park. They didn't lead them over the bridge, but instead to one side. The bridge, again, was lined with a number of crows. They'd moved from the fencing across the road and were now there. They'd followed them, airborne, the entire time, while one crow had remained hopping on its two little feet, beckoning the resident of the flat to this small area. The crow then went to one side of the path, to one side of the bridge, in a small corner between the fencing and the wall. The crow nimbly hopped through a small hole in the hedge and carried on inside. The resident questioned it for a moment, but had come this far, so decided they would follow as well. It wasn't nearly as easy for the resident as it was for the crow to navigate this small little tunnel in a hedge, but with some squeezing and some scrapes and some grazes from the nearby branches, bracken, broken bottles, and litter, they managed to climb their way in. Once inside, they found a small hollow. In the hollow was a small number of crows. The crow they'd followed head to the other side of this small clearing, the bushes making a roof over the top, and on either side were 3 crows lined up with their heads dipped down, staring into a small divot in the ground, a small hole. As the resident was taking this in, they also, without choice, took in a horrible smell. In the small pit in the ground was a decomposing crow. It seemed like the pit had been dug for it, for specifically this purpose. It looked like a small piece of black thread had been tied around it, holding its wings in place, so they didn't flop to the side. It was almost dignified. At the head of this small pit was the card that displayed the blackbird. The crow that they'd followed then placed this card on top of the crow in the pit, and then started tapping on something nearby. It tapped a few times and then squawked. When it squawked, the crows that were lining the small pit would squawk as well, but low and quiet, almost whispered. It had the same rhythm, it had the same pitch, it had the same key as what the main crow was squawking, but it was almost under their breath. This happened a few times. A few squawks, a few whispers, a few taps against the ground. Once this had been done a few times, the crow began to use its feet to kick dirt into the small pit. Once it had kicked this dirt a few times, it looked up to the resident of the flat, astonished at what they'd witnessed, genuinely thinking this could have all been a dream. They began to take handfuls of dirt and fill in the pit. They tamped the ground down, smoothed it off, and then dusted their hands to one side. They lay there, on their stomach, looking at the now filled-in hole, not quite knowing what to do. The crows left. The crows outside sat on the wall, flew away, and eventually they wriggled backwards, climbed out of the undergrowth, dusted themselves down, and walked away. What else could they do? The crows stopped coming to their house in such large numbers, but almost every day another crow would arrive. Another crow would follow them to work, another crow would follow them home. Were they different crows? Or were they the same one crow? They could never quite tell the difference. Every few days, new sun-bleached bones would be placed outside. Every few days they would receive a bracelet, an earring, a ring, some small trinket, something shiny, something pleasant to a crow. Every time they received one of these trinkets, the resident was fascinated. Without knowing quite what to do with them, they instead would wear the bracelets, they got their ears pierced to wear the earrings, and they started tying together the bones into small necklaces. As time went by, they made more and more necklaces and wore more and more jewellery. People in the street would stare at the strange person, with bones tied around their neck. People would stop them and ask if they needed help, particularly police officers, confused as to why someone would be walking around with a series of sun-bleached bones hanging around their neck or from their ears via earrings. Nothing ever came of it, but it certainly wasn't approved of. People at work didn't like the way that they smelt. They wore the bones underneath their work shirts, and every now and then a sort of musty smell would emanate, particularly on summer days. People weren't very fond of it. Their colleagues began to whisper about the fact that there were always crows nearby whenever they were, whisper about the fact that they carried bones and what looked like dead people's rings. There were stories that this person was a serial killer, and that the things that they had were trophies that they'd taken. This wasn't true, of course, but it was difficult to dispel a rumour like this. It was difficult to explain that the things that you had were gifts from crows and that you didn't want to offend them. Eventually they no longer saw the value in going to their job. What did it really do for them? They were living in a crappy one-room apartment. They were going to a job that they didn't like so they could afford a house that they didn't like. Whereas, every time they went into the woods, they'd received gifts. Sometimes they'd even receive an audience of crows. They would sit and simply make noises, seeing if they could figure out a way to communicate. And eventually, they realised that they didn't want to go back inside each evening. Maybe with a sleeping bag or a tent, they might be able to stay outside indefinitely, so that's what they did. They head back down to the industrial estate and this time went to the Argos. They spent the remaining money that they had on a tent, a sleeping bag, a bottle for water, and that was it. What happened to the friend of the crows is relatively unknown. Local newspapers often report on strange sightings of someone on the outskirts of town walking around, covered in an outfit made of bones and silver. Sometimes their old colleagues would tell the story of the strange crow person that had started working there completely normally and then, over time, fallen into madness and derangement. The friend of the crows was never famous amongst people, but to the crows, they were someone incredibly important. Someone who'd given up their time and their energy. Someone who'd become closer with the community than any human ever had. No person knows where the resident of the flat died. No person knows where they were buried. No person knows when they died. No person knows what they were wearing when they died. No person even knows how to report back to the family. But there were many who did know. There were many who were involved in the burial. There were many who were involved in dispersing the bones and the rings, the earrings, back out to members of their community. Something to remember, something that signified that one oddity, that one anomaly, that one intelligent person who had managed to show the crows quite how smart they were. Thank you very much for tuning in again to another installment of these short and strange stories, intended to be both odd and relatable. I hope you've enjoyed this. I have been your host. As always, bless the outsiders, bless yourselves. If you enjoyed listening to this story, please let me know. And if there's anything you didn't enjoy, keep it to yourself.